Year 6, we're reading chapter 43 today. We weren't always homeless, Zero said. I remember a yellow room. How old were you when you... Stanley started to ask, but he couldn't find the right words. When you moved out. I don't know, I must have been real little, because I don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I do remember standing in a crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrists and made my hands clap together. She used to sing that song to me, the one you sang. It was different though. Zero spoke slowly, as if searching his brain for memories and clues. And then later, we lived on the street. But I don't know why we left the house. I'm pretty sure it was a house and not an apartment. I know my room was yellow. It was late afternoon. They were resting in the shadow of the thumb. They had spent the morning picking onions and putting them in the sack. It didn't take long, but long enough so that they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave at the first hint of daylight, so they'd have plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure he could find the right hole. Then they would hide by it until everyone went to sleep. They would dig for as long as it seemed safe and not a second longer. And then, treasure or no treasure, they'd head up the dirt road. If it was absolutely safe, they'd try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, Zero had said. Remember, Stanley had warned, the door to the rec room squeaks. Now he lay on his back, trying to save his strength for the long days ahead. He wondered what happened to Zero's parents, but he didn't ask. Zero didn't like answering questions. It was better just to let him talk when he felt like it. Stanley thought about his own parents. In her last letter, his mum was worried that they might be evicted from their apartment because of the smell of burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if they'd been told that he ran away from camp. Were they told that he was dead? An image appeared in his head of his parents hugging each other and crying, but he tried not to think about it. Instead, he tried to recapture the feelings he'd had the night before, the inexplicable feeling of happiness, the sense of destiny. But those didn't return. He just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They dumped their caps in the waterhole before putting them on their heads, and Zero held the shovel and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions, and the 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of the broken jar on the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing out a patch of weeds. Zero turned and looked up toward the mountaintop. That's a long way. You were light, Stanley said. You'd already thrown up everything that was in your stomach. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped on a loose rock, slipped, and then fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack and onions spilled all around him. He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed onto a thorny vine. The vine ripped out of the earth but slowed him enough that he was able to stop himself. Are you all right? Asked Zero from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled a thorn out of the palm of his hand. Oh, yes, he said. He was all right. He was more worried about the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way, and Stanley pulled some thorns out of his pant legs. The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected them like styrofoam packaging material. Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me, Zero said. They'd lost about a third of the onions, but they recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was just rising above the lake and they walked directly towards it. Soon they stood on the edge of a cliff, looking down on the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of the Mary Lou off in the distance. "You thirsty?" Stanley asked. "No," said Zero. "How about you?" "No," Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink. Although they didn't mention it, it had become a kind of challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. It was a different spot from where they'd climbed up. They eased themselves down from one ledge to another and let themselves slide in other places, being especially careful with the sack. Stanley could no longer see the Mary Lou, but he headed in what he thought was the right direction. As the sun rose, so did the familiar haze of heat and dirt. "You thirsty?" Zero asked. "No," said Stanley. "Because you have 3 full jars of water," said Zero. "I thought maybe it was getting kind of heavy for you. If you drink some, it would just lighten your load a little." "Yeah, but I'm not thirsty," said Stanley. "But if you want a drink, I'll give you some." "No," said Zero. "I'm not thirsty. I was just worried about you." Stanley smiled. "Me? I'm a camel," he said. They walked for what seemed like a very long time and still never came across the Mary Lou. Stan was pretty sure that they were heading in the right direction. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were heading toward the setting sun, and so now they were headed toward the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and west, more southeast and southwest, but he wasn't really sure how that made a difference. His whole throat felt like it was coated with sandpaper. "You sure you're not thirsty?" he asked. "Not me," said Zero. His voice was all dry and raspy. When they did finally take a drink, they agreed to do it at exactly the same time. Zero, who was now carrying the sack, set it down and took out 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last, since it couldn't accidentally break. "You know, I'm not thirsty," Stanley said as he unscrewed the lid. "I'm just having a drink, so you will." "Well," said Zero, "I'm just drinking, so you will." They clinked their jars together, and each watching the other, they poured the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first to spot the Mary Lou, maybe a 1/4 mile away, just a little off to the right, so they headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. "I don't know what happened to my mother," Zero said. "She left and she never came back." Stanley peeled an onion. "She couldn't always take me with her," Zero said. "Sometimes she had to do things by herself." Stanley had the feeling Zero was explaining things to himself. "She'd just tell me to wait in a certain place for her when I was real little. I had to wait in small areas like on a porch step or a doorway. 'Now, don't leave here until I get back,' she'd say. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, and I'd hug it the whole time she was gone. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in bigger areas, like stay on this block or don't leave the park. But even then, I still held Jaffe." Stanley guessed that Jaffe was the name of Zero's giraffe. "And then," said Zero, "one day, she didn't come back." His voice sounded suddenly hollow. "I waited for her at Laney Park." Laney Park?" said Stanley. "I've been there." "You know the playscape?" said Zero. "Yeah, I've played on it." "I waited there," said Zero, "for more than a month. You know that tunnel you crawl through? Between the slide and the swinging bridge, that's where I slept." They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. When I left camp, I was heading straight toward Big Thumb, he said. I saw the boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn to the left a little. Zero was lost in thought. What? Oh, okay, he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kids had a birthday party, Zero said. I guess it was about 2 weeks after my mum left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape and balloons were tied to it. The kids looked to be the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked me if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at the party, even though it wasn't their playscape. There was this one mother who kept staring at me, like I was some kind of monster. Then later, a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake, but then that same mum told me, go away. And she told all the kids to stay away from me, so I never got the piece of cake. I ran away so fast, I forgot to take Jaffe with me. Did you ever find him? Asked Stanley. I mean, it. For a moment, Zero didn't answer, and then he said, well, he wasn't real. Stanley thought again about his own parents, how awful it would be for them to never know if he was alive or dead. He realised that was how Zero must have felt, not knowing what had happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero never mentioned his father. Hold on, said Zero, stopping abruptly. We're going the wrong way. No, said Stanley, this is right. You were heading towards Big Thumb when you saw the boat off to your right, said Zero. That means we should have turned right when we left the boat.